Some men ride into town looking for trouble. Gideon Cross rode into Red Ash trying to outrun it, and found something he never expected: a woman with dirt under her fingernails and more courage than anyone carrying a gun. If you love stories about real people, hard-won love, and justice earned with sweat and blood, hit like now and leave a comment letting me know which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has come. Now, let's begin. The horse came in at a walk, which was the first wrong thing. Everyone in Red Ash knew that riders who came in at a walk were either dead in the saddle or carrying something they didn't want anyone to see. The big roan stallion moved down the center of Main Street with its head dropped low and its rider hunched forward, right arm pressed tight against his ribs like he was holding himself together through sheer stubbornness. Dust rose in small clouds around the horse's hooves. The afternoon sun hit the rider's face and showed nothing, no expression, no acknowledgement of the dozen or so people who stopped what they were doing to stare. Hattie Morrow noticed him first from the porch of her dry goods store. She was a widow of 3 years, moderately wealthy by Red Ash standards, and she had a particular interest in men who arrived in town without a woman attached to them. She shielded her eyes and looked hard at the rider. "Lord above," she said to no one in particular. "Is that Gideon Cross?" The name moved through the street like a stone dropped in still water. Gideon Cross. People knew that name the way they knew the names of bad weather and drought. Not because they'd experienced it personally, but because they'd heard enough stories to understand what it meant when it showed up on your doorstep. He'd tracked men through the Rockies in the dead of winter. He'd brought back outlaws that 3 other trackers had given up on. He'd spent 6 years working contracts across 4 territories and had never, as far as anyone could say with certainty, failed to find what he was looking for. He was also, and this part traveled just as fast as the rest of it, unmarried, landless, and rumored to be sitting on enough saved earnings to buy half a county if he felt like it. Hattie Morrow smoothed her skirt and stepped off the porch. She wasn't the only one moving. Clara Oates appeared from the millinery shop 2 doors down, hat already straightened and color already risen in her cheeks. Down at the far end of the street, Dorothea Finch, who was the wealthiest widow in Red Ash and knew it, stepped out of the land office where her late husband's business had sat gathering value for 4 years. She moved with the particular confidence of a woman who believed the outcome of most competitions was already determined before they began. Gideon Cross didn't look at any of them. He stopped his horse in front of the water trough near the livery stable, stepped down from the saddle with the kind of careful slowness that meant something was wrong with his body, and led the animal to the water. Only then, with his back to most of the watching street, did he let the arm he'd been holding against his side fall loose. His right hand hung at an angle that hands weren't supposed to hang. "He's hurt," someone said. He was. The sleeve of his jacket was dark and stiff with dried blood from the elbow down, and when he reached up to loosen the roan's girth strap with his left hand, he did it slowly, deliberately, the way a man does things when the alternative is falling over. Hattie Morrow reached him first. She was quick when she needed to be. "Mr. Cross," she said, coming around the water trough with what she hoped was an expression of warm concern rather than eager calculation. "My goodness, you look like you've been through something terrible. I have a full guest room, clean sheets, proper meals. My housekeeper is the best cook in the county." "I'm fine," he said. He didn't look at her. "You are not fine." Clara Oates materialized on his other side. "That hand needs to be seen to. I know a doctor 2 towns over. I could send a rider." "I don't need a doctor. You clearly do." "Ma'am." The word came out flat, not rude exactly, but with a kind of finality that made Clara Oates stop talking mid-sentence. "I appreciate it. I don't need anything right now except water for my horse." The roan drank. Gideon stood very still beside it, one hand on the animal's neck, and looked at nothing in particular. There was a quality to his stillness that was unsettling. Not the stillness of a man at rest, but the stillness of a man using most of his concentration just to stay vertical. Dorothea Finch arrived last, which was a choice. She had decided on the walk down the street that arriving last was more dignified than arriving first. She was 52, handsome in a sharp-featured way, and accustomed to getting what she wanted from men through the straightforward application of money and social pressure. "Gideon Cross," she said, with the familiarity of someone who'd rehearsed the tone. I knew your father back before he moved north. You have his eyes. She paused. I have the finest house in Red Ash, 4 guest rooms, and a surgeon who visits from Callaway Springs twice a month. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. Gideon looked at her. It was the first time since he'd arrived that he'd actually looked at anyone, and Dorothea Finch almost flinched at it. Not because it was threatening, but because it was entirely empty of whatever response she'd expected. He wasn't calculating. He wasn't even particularly interested. Thank you, he said. No. He took his horse by the lead and walked it toward the livery entrance. The 3 women stood in the street behind him. Well, Hattie Morrow said, after a moment. Nobody added anything to that. Lena Rowan was not watching from the street. She was at the edge of her property, which sat at the north end of Red Ash, where the town's neat grid of buildings gave up trying to be organized and sprawled into scrubland and dry grass. Her grandfather had built the cabin there in the early days of the settlement, and when he died 2 years ago, he'd left it to her because there was no one else to leave it to, and because of the 2 of them, she was the one who'd actually kept the place running. She was on her knees in the herb garden, which occupied the sunniest strip of ground beside the cabin's east wall. The garden was not large, maybe 30 feet by 12, but it was dense and deliberate, organized in ways that made sense to Lena, even if they looked chaotic to anyone else. Yarrow grew beside calendula. Comfrey spread its broad leaves over a section of dark soil near the fence. There were plants she'd grown from seed she ordered through the mail, plants she'd transplanted from the creek bank a mile away, plants she'd coaxed through 3 dry summers with water hauled in buckets when the well ran low. She was pulling a section of bindweed that had gotten into the lavender when she heard the footsteps on her path. She looked up. The man standing at the gate was tall, dark-haired, wearing a jacket that had seen better months, and holding his right arm in a way that immediately told her 3 or 4 things about what was wrong with it. Someone at the livery said you treat injuries, he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Not soft, just controlled, like a man who'd learned a long time ago to keep the volume of things internal. I do, she said. She stood up, pulled off her gardening gloves, and looked at his arm. How long ago? 3 days. She kept her face neutral. 3 days with an injury that bad was not good, and something in her expression must have shown it, because he said, I know. Come inside. She didn't ask his name. She didn't need it yet. She needed to see the hand first. Inside the cabin, the light was better and the hand was worse. Lena had him sit at the work table near the window and carefully peeled back what was left of the bandaging he'd done himself. Strips of torn shirt, she noted, not proper cloth, wound too tight in places and not tight enough in others. She worked without speaking, her attention entirely on what her hands were doing. The injury was a deep laceration that had started at the base of his thumb and traveled across the palm, probably from a blade. Something else had gone wrong with the middle 2 fingers, either broken or badly wrenched, swollen to twice their normal size and bruised purple-yellow at the knuckles. There was heat in the wound that shouldn't still be there after 3 days. You should have had this seen to sooner, she said. I know that too. Where were you? Mountains. No one to see it. She glanced at his face. He was watching her work with the same emptiness she'd noticed in his eyes from across the gate. Not indifferent exactly, more like a man who'd gotten very good at keeping his reactions behind a wall somewhere. This is going to hurt, she said. I figured. She cleaned the wound with a diluted yarrow solution, which stung badly enough that she saw his jaw lock and his left hand grip the edge of the table, but he didn't make a sound. Then she examined the fingers more carefully, pressing along the bones to find where the damage was. 2 fingers, not broken, she said. One is the middle one. It needs to be set. He looked at her for a moment. Can you do that? I've done it before, not on myself, obviously. She hesitated. I won't pretend it's pleasant. Nothing about the last 3 days has been pleasant. She set the finger. He made one short, sharp sound and then was silent, and she worked quickly and without wasting motion, splinting it against the adjacent finger with clean cloth strips she kept in a jar on the shelf. Then she packed the laceration with a comfrey poultice, covered it properly, and began the process of wrapping everything in a way that would actually hold. You'll need to keep it dry, she said. The poultice needs to stay on for at least 2 days. After that, the dressing needs changing every day until the wound closes. If it starts to smell wrong, or the heat spreads up the arm, you need to get to a proper doctor immediately. What counts as spreading? Past your wrist means come back here. Past your elbow means ride hard for Callaway Springs. He looked at the bandaged hand for a moment. What do I owe you? What do you have? He reached into his jacket with his left hand and came out with a few coins. She looked at them, counted them mentally, and shook her head. Give me 2 bits. That's not enough for what you just did. I know what I just did, and I know what 2 bits covers. It's fine. She took the coins. Come back tomorrow and I'll change the dressing. He stood. He was taller standing than she'd registered sitting, and the cabin felt slightly smaller with him in it. Gideon Cross, he said. She'd figured. I know. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, but close to it. You knew before you let me in? I didn't know until you sat down and I got a proper look at you. You matched the description. She moved to the door and opened it. Lena Rowan. I know, he said, with the smallest hint of something that might, in better circumstances, have been a smile. The man at the livery told me. Blah. He came back the next morning, as she'd told him to. Lena changed the dressing, checked the wound for the early signs of infection she'd been watching for, and decided, cautiously, that it was going in the right direction. The heat was down slightly. The laceration was closing at the edges. She repacked it, rewrapped it, and reminded him about the restrictions. No gripping anything with that hand, she said. For how long? A week at minimum. 2 would be better. He looked like she'd told him his horse had 3 legs. I understand that's inconvenient, she said. It's fine. It is not fine, but it's necessary. He came back the day after that, and the day after that. By the 4th visit, it had become something almost normal. Lena at her work table with her jars and her cloth strips, Gideon sitting across from her with his arm laid out flat, both of them talking or not talking with equal ease. He was quieter than most people she dealt with, but not uncomfortable in silence, which she appreciated. She dealt with enough patients who filled every pause with nervous chatter. On the 4th day, he asked about the garden. What's the comfrey for? Tissue repair, mostly. It speeds healing in soft tissue. She glanced up. That's what's in your poultice. And the yarrow was for the initial cleaning. It slows bleeding and has some properties that fight infection. You learned this from someone? My grandfather, partly. And books, partly. And trial and error. She paused. Mostly trial and error. Is that what I am? Trial and error? You're a relatively straightforward case, as it happens. She tied off the bandaging. Ask me again in a week, and I'll tell you if it stays that way. He almost smiled again. She was starting to recognize it. A slight loosening around the eyes. A fractional shift in the set of his mouth that lasted maybe half a second before his face went back to neutral. The town had opinions. This was not surprising. Red Ash was small enough that everyone's business was effectively everyone's business, and Gideon Cross turning up at Lena Rowan's cabin every morning instead of accepting the perfectly good offers he'd received from Hattie Morrow, Clara Oates, and Dorothea Finch was the kind of thing that generated conversation. Lena heard most of it secondhand. She went into town twice a week for supplies and mail, and both trips inevitably involved overhearing things she wasn't meant to hear or receiving comments that were technically addressed to her but designed to land somewhere more vulnerable. Strange choice, Hattie Morrow said to Clara Oates, loudly enough to carry across the general store on the morning of Lena's 4th post-Gideon supply run. A man like that, accepting charity from a girl who can barely afford salt. It's not charity, Lena said without turning around from the shelf she was examining. He pays for his treatment. Silence for a moment. Well, Hattie said. Still. The still was doing a lot of work, Lena thought. It meant, you're not the right kind of woman for the attention you're receiving. It meant, something must be wrong with him if he chose you. It meant, we had plans and you've disrupted them without even trying. She bought her salt and her dried beans and her 2 yards of cotton cloth and walked home without saying anything else. But that evening, when Gideon came by for his daily dressing change, she noticed him watching her more carefully than usual. Not the wound, but her. The way she moved around the cabin, the set of her shoulders, the pace of her hands. Something happened in town, he said. She didn't look up from what she was doing. Nothing unusual. What does that mean? It means this is how it usually is. I've lived here for 7 years, and people have had opinions about me for most of them. She finished with the bandage. I'm used to it. What kind of opinions? She sat back and looked at him directly. The kind you get when you're not wealthy, not well-connected, and not inclined to pretend either of those things bothers you. She paused. I didn't marry when people thought I should. I didn't sell the cabin when people thought I should. I make a living treating injuries and selling medicinal preparations, which most people here think is either eccentric or suspicious, depending on the day. And now there are people who think you're chasing me, he said. She looked at him steadily. Are you bothered by that? He thought about it for a moment in a way that seemed genuine rather than polite. No, he said. Then I'm not either. What? It was on the 6th day that he told her what had happened to his hand. He hadn't volunteered the information earlier, and she hadn't pressed for it. The injury told its own story, and a patient's reasons for their injuries weren't her business unless they affected the treatment. But on the 6th day, he came in earlier than usual and sat down heavily, and she could see from the line of his shoulders that something had shifted overnight. She changed the dressing in silence. The wound was looking significantly better. Another week, and it would be closed. I was tracking a man for a rancher named Galt, he said when she was almost finished. Contract work. I found the man easier than Galt expected, but when I brought him in, something about the whole thing felt wrong. The paperwork, the charges. The man I'd tracked, he wasn't... He stopped. I started asking questions. Galt didn't like that. Lena kept her hands moving. The hand? One of Galt's hired men. I got away, but it took a few days. He paused. There's land schemes happening out here. Big ones. I'd only started to figure out the shape of it when I had to run. She tied off the last wrap and sat back. Land schemes. Buying up ranches for nothing, forcing people off property they've held for years, not just Galt. A group of them, working together. He looked at her. You own this land outright? The question landed with more weight than she'd expected. My grandfather's deed, yes. He nodded slowly, like that answered something he'd been considering. Why are you telling me this? She asked. He looked at his bandaged hand for a moment. Because you've been honest with me every day for 6 days, and I don't meet that as often as you'd think. He stood up. And because I think you should know what's moving through this area before it gets to your front door. She walked him to the door the way she always did. He stepped out into the morning light and then stopped, which was something he didn't usually do. The garden, he said, without turning around. How long did it take you to build it? 5 years, she said. He nodded once, still not looking at her, and walked down the path. The thing about small towns was that information moved faster than comfort. Lena understood this the following week when she went into the general store and found 3 men she didn't recognize standing near the front counter having a conversation with Owen Marsh, who ran the store and who was, as the whole town knew, connected to Dorothea Finch's business dealings through a series of arrangements that were never quite spelled out in public. The 3 men stopped talking when she came in. One of them looked at her the way people sometimes look at a thing they're considering purchasing. She walked to the back of the store where the herb supplies were kept and kept her attention on her list. But she heard enough. They were talking about the Hendricks property, a small ranch on the east side of town whose owner, old Caleb Hendricks, had died in the spring. The widow was asking a fair price for the land. The men were talking about the price she'd actually receive. One of them laughed at something the other said. It was the particular laugh of men who believed the outcome of things had already been decided by people above their pay grade. Lena bought what she needed and left. She told Gideon that afternoon, while she was changing his dressing cham. The last change, she calculated. The wound was nearly closed and the fingers were healing well. He listened without interrupting. Hendricks' widow is May Hendricks, he said. She has 2 sons, both under 10. You know her? I know of her. Caleb Hendricks was mentioned in some of the paperwork I saw before everything went sideways. He was quiet for a moment. How many families in this area have sold in the last 2 years? I don't know the number exactly. 4 or 5 that I know of. Lena thought about it. The Pratt family, the Colsons, Old Man Wheeler, but people said he sold willingly. Maybe he did. Gideon's voice was measured. Or maybe by the time they got to Wheeler, they'd figured out how to make willing look exactly like forced. She finished with the dressing, and he flexed his hand experimentally, carefully, testing the give of the healed skin across his palm. Another week, she said. Don't push it. You've said that before. And I'll keep saying it until you stop looking like you're about to ignore me. That got the almost smile. Longer this time. She was starting to wonder if she'd ever see what a real one looked like. The trouble started on a Tuesday. She knew the day because she'd been making a batch of salve that morning, which she always did on Tuesdays, and she'd been thinking about the consistency of the last batch and whether she'd added too much beeswax when she heard hoofbeats on her path. Multiple sets. She put down the wooden spoon she was using to stir and went to the window. 3 riders. Men she didn't know, riding horses she didn't recognize. Big, well-fed horses, not the shaggy working animals most Red Ash residents kept. They stopped at her gate and didn't dismount. She went to the door and opened it. Lena Rowan? The one in the center said. He had a flat, placid face and the particular ease of a man who'd never been told no in a context that actually mattered to him. That's right, she said. You own this property? He made it sound like he already knew the answer and was asking out of courtesy. I do. Be a good time to consider selling. Land out this direction is going to be changing over the next year or so. New operations, bigger scale. Independent homesteads are going to find it hard going. He glanced around at the cabin, the garden, the small outbuildings. We're prepared to make you a fair offer today. Cash. Lena leaned against her doorframe. What's the offer? He named a number. It was not a fair offer. It was so far from fair that for a moment she wasn't sure she'd heard it correctly. The cabin alone, the structure itself, was worth more than that. No, she said. The man's pleasant expression didn't change. You might want to think on it. I've thought on it. Miss Rowan? He shifted his weight in the saddle. People who don't take the opportunity to sell while the selling's good sometimes find that later on, the opportunity's gone and the situation's considerably less comfortable. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back inside and closed the door. She stood in the middle of her cabin with her heart beating fast and her hands entirely steady, which was a thing she'd noticed about herself in moments of threat. Her hands always stayed steady. It was the rest of her that had to manage as best it could. She went back to her salve. She didn't tell Gideon about the men at the gate. She wasn't sure why. Partly because she didn't want to make assumptions about what it meant. Partly because she'd handled difficult things on her own for 7 years, and her instinct was still to keep handling them that way. What she didn't know, and wouldn't learn until later, was that he'd seen the riders leaving. He'd been coming up the back path through the scrubland. He'd started using it in the last few days. She hadn't thought much about it. And he'd stopped in the trees when he heard the hoofbeats and watched the 3 men ride out of her property and back toward the main road. He recognized the horses. He came to the door 20 minutes later. She let him in, and he sat at the work table with the air of a man deciding how to say something. Who were those men? He said. It wasn't a question. She put down the salve she was still working on. I don't know their names. What did they want? The property. She paused. They made an offer. I declined. He looked at her face, not the way people usually looked at her face, assessing or dismissive or calculating, but like he was reading something. Were they threatening? They were politely suggesting that my situation would become less comfortable if I didn't reconsider. That's a threat. That's one way to read it. She sat down across from him. I've had people tell me my situation was difficult before. Some of them were right, and some of them were wrong. I'm still here. He was quiet for a long moment. She could see him working through something, the same way she'd seen him work through pain during the early dressing changes. Methodical, contained, not suppressing it so much as organizing it into something manageable. The syndicate, he said finally. The operation I told you about. The people running it, I only knew one name, Galt, and I only knew partial names of the men working with him. But those horses those men were riding, he stopped. There's a particular brand that Galt's operation uses. 3 linked rings. One of those horses had it on the left hip. The kitchen went very quiet. So they're connected, she said. They're connected. She looked at her hands for a moment, thought about the 5 years she'd spent building the garden, thought about her grandfather's deed, tucked in the box under the floorboard near the hearth where she kept important papers, thought about May Hendricks and her 2 sons under 10. What do you know about what they're doing exactly? She asked. The full shape of it. Some. He leaned forward. What do you know about the water rights situation in this area? The creek that runs through the East Ranches? It's shared. It's always been shared. Everyone with land near it has access. Not anymore, if what I was reading is right. The operation has been acquiring property around the headwaters. If they own enough of the upstream land, they control access for everyone downstream. He looked at her. The East Ranches dry up. The independent homesteaders run out of water. They sell. He paused. Or they don't sell, and something else happens. Lena sat with that for a long moment. How many people are involved in running this? She asked. I'm not sure. At least a dozen that I saw directly, probably more. And they have the law? The county sheriff's office, yes. I found enough to be fairly certain of that. He said it straightforwardly, without apparent anger, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. Anyone going to the law with a complaint gets nowhere. She looked at him. And you're telling me this because you're already in it, he said, and because you're going to need to know the full situation to make good decisions. He met her gaze steadily. And because I'm not planning to ride away. The cabin was quiet except for the sound of wind against the north wall. Why not? She asked. He took a moment before answering, like the words needed to be found rather than just said. I've spent a lot of years doing what I'm contracted to do and riding on, he said. Finding the thing I was hired to find, collecting what I was owed, and moving to the next one. And most of the time, that was the right call. But I've been sitting in this cabin for 8 days, and I've been watching this town, and I've been watching you. He stopped. Reset. There are people here who are being stolen from and who don't know it yet, he said. And the ones who do know it are afraid to say anything because the people doing the stealing have made themselves into something that looks like authority. He paused. I'm not good at a lot of things, but I'm good at finding what's hidden and making it visible. And I'm not contracted to anyone here, which means I'm free to choose what I do with what I find. Lena looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, you understand? Or all right, you're in? All right, I'm in, she said. What do you need from me? For the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. Not the almost smile she'd been cataloging for 8 days. An actual one, brief, a little crooked, with something surprised in it, like he hadn't expected to produce it. Information, he said. You know this town, you know who trusts who owes who's afraid and who isn't. That's worth more than anything I've got right now. She thought about Hattie Morrow and Clara Oates and Dorothea Finch, all their careful social mathematics. She thought about May Hendricks and her sons. She thought about the 5 families who'd sold and moved on, and whether moved on was actually what had happened to them. Then we'd better start, she said. The garden was visible from most of the south path into town. People had walked past it for 5 years, some with curiosity, some with indifference, some with the particular kind of dismissal reserved for things that don't fit into recognizable categories. Lena had planted it in a time of necessity and tended it out of something that was partly practicality and partly the stubbornness of a woman who'd been told too many times that what she was doing wasn't worth doing. She walked through it that evening after Gideon had gone, checking the plants the way she checked them every evening, looking for damage or drought or the early signs of disease. The lavender was coming in well. The comfrey had spread further than she'd intended, as it always did. The yarrow was nearly ready for cutting. She crouched down near the calendula and pulled a stray grass stem that had gotten in among the roots. She'd told Gideon she was in. She meant it. She'd meant it the moment she said it, the same way she'd meant it when she'd refused to sell, the same way she'd meant it when she'd decided at 22 to stay in Red Ash instead of going somewhere that might have been easier. She wasn't built for the decision that looked safe but wasn't, for the retreat that felt like sense but was actually just fear dressed up in reasonable clothing. The thing about having spent 5 years building something in difficult soil was that you got very familiar with the difference between hard and impossible. This was hard. She understood that clearly. She stood up and looked out at the scrubland that stretched north from her fence line, at the darkening sky and the first stars beginning to show, at the lights of red ash visible in the distance at the end of the path. The same people who'd been politely dismissive of her would now be watching. Some would be waiting for her to fail. Some, she suspected, wouldn't be watching at all. They'd be too busy managing their own fear, their own sense that the ground under their feet was less solid than it had seemed. Her grandfather had built this cabin on land that everyone said was too far from the center of things to be worth developing. He'd built it anyway, and she'd stayed in it anyway, and the garden had grown anyway. She went inside and put the kettle on, and began making a list of everyone in Red Ash who she thought might be willing to listen. The list Lena made that night had 11 names on it. By morning, she'd crossed out 4. Not because those 4 were bad people. Some of them were decent enough, in the ordinary run of things. But decent in ordinary circumstances and reliable under pressure were 2 different qualities, and she'd had enough time in Red Ash to learn which was which. The people she crossed off were the ones who'd always been just slightly more worried about what others thought of them than about whether the thing being done was right. That tendency didn't get better when the stakes got higher. It got worse. The 7 names she kept for different reasons. May Hendricks, because she had the most to lose and had probably already figured out that the offer she was going to receive for Caleb's land wasn't going to be what she deserved. Tom Briggs, the farrier, because he had no significant landholdings for the syndicate to threaten, and because he was the kind of man who got angry slowly but stayed angry. The Vasquez brothers, who ran a small livestock operation on the south edge of town and had come from somewhere with enough difficulty in it that they'd developed a healthy skepticism of men who arrived with smooth talk and legal-looking paperwork. And 3 others, a feed store owner, a woman who ran the town's only bathhouse, and an elderly surveyor named Potts who'd been mapping land in the area for 30 years and knew exactly where every property line sat. She showed the list to Gideon the next morning. He read it without comment for a moment. "Potts," he said. "The surveyor. You know him? Heard of him? If the syndicate has been filing forged property records, a surveyor with 30 years of local knowledge could take apart those filings in front of a judge." He handed the list back. "What's your plan for approaching them?" "Not all at once," she said, "and not by telling them everything yet. First, I need to know who'll actually talk and who'll panic." She folded the list. "I'll start with May Hendricks." She went to see May that afternoon. May Hendricks was 36, raw-boned and tired in the way that 2 years of managing a ranch without her husband had made her tired, and she had eyes that had clearly been doing a lot of calculating lately. She poured Lena coffee from a dented pot and sat across from her at the kitchen table while her 2 boys made noise somewhere outside, and she said, before Lena could open the subject herself, "They've already been here, 2 weeks ago." "What did they offer you?" May told her. It was an even lower number than what they'd offered Lena. "I told them I needed time to think," May said, "but they're coming back next week." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Lena, I don't have the money to fight anyone. I have $40 saved and 2 sons and a ranch that's held together with prayer and stubbornness." "You might not need money," Lena said carefully. "You might need information and people willing to stand together." She paused. "Are you willing to hear more before you decide?" May was quiet for a long moment. Outside, one of the boys yelled something at the other. A goat somewhere made its opinion known. "Tell me," May said. Lena told her what she knew. Not everything, not yet, but enough. The water rights, the forged records, the county sheriff's office that wasn't going to help. May listened without interrupting, and when Lena finished, she sat with it for a while. "How many families have already sold?" she asked. "That I know of for certain. 5. "And they just left?" "They left," Lena said. "I don't know what condition they left in." May absorbed that. The tiredness in her face was still there, but underneath it something had shifted, gone from dull to sharp. "All right," she said. "What do you need from me?" Gideon spent those same days doing his own kind of work. His hand was well enough now that he could use it for light tasks, and he'd been quietly rebuilding his knowledge of the area's geography. Riding the roads and paths around Red Ash in the early mornings before many people were stirring, mapping what he saw against what he'd read in the documents he had managed to take from Golt's operation before everything had gone wrong. The 3 linked rings he'd seen on the horse's hip showed up twice more over 4 days of watching. Once on a horse tied outside the land office when Dorothea Finch was inside for an unusually long meeting, and once on a wagon coming out of the road that led toward the East Creek headwaters. That second sighting bothered him more than the first. He'd ridden up toward the headwaters the following morning and found what he'd half expected to find: fresh construction, new fencing running across land that the old survey record said was common-use territory. The creek itself was still flowing freely, but the infrastructure to control it was going in, piece by piece, in locations that most people in Red Ash wouldn't ride past often enough to notice. He came back and told Lena that evening. She was at the work table, not working on anything medical. She had a piece of paper in front of her covered in small, precise handwriting, calculations of some kind. She looked up when he came in, and he could tell from her expression that her day had also produced things worth talking about. "May Hendricks is in," she said, "and I think Tom Briggs. I haven't gotten to the Vasquez brothers yet." "The headwaters situation is further along than I thought," he said. He sat down and explained what he'd found. Lena listened with her pen still in her hand, tapping it once against the table in a rhythm that he'd started to recognize as her thinking hard tell. "If they complete that fencing," she said, "every ranch with creek access on the east side of town loses reliable water by next summer." He paused. "And then those ranches become worth a fraction of their current value. And then offers get made." "We need Potts," she said. "If we can get him out to document what's being built and where, and compare it against the original survey maps." "It's evidence," he said. "Useful evidence, if we can get it in front of someone who matters." He looked at her. "That's the part I haven't figured out yet. The county sheriff is compromised. A territorial court is months away." "There's a land commissioner's office," Lena said, "in Duranville. That's the next territory over. Different jurisdiction, different relationships." She paused. Potts would know the right office and the right name to write to. Gideon looked at her for a moment. "You've been thinking about this longer than tonight." "Since the men came to my gate," she said. "I started thinking about it then. I just didn't have enough pieces yet." He nodded slowly. There was something he'd been turning over in his mind for 2 days. Something that had started as a practical consideration and had grown into something else. Something he wasn't entirely sure how to say without it sounding either calculating or strange. He'd made decisions in his life, contract decisions, professional decisions, by assessing situation and resources and acting accordingly. This was a different kind of decision, and he was aware of not being particularly experienced with the different kind. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. "A practical matter." She set down her pen. "All right. The men who came to your gate, well, they'll come back. You said no once, and they'll come back with more pressure, and the next time it won't be 3 polite riders." He watched her face. "You owning this property individually is a vulnerability. If anything happened to you, legally, physically, this land is easier to acquire without anyone to contest it." "I know that," she said. "If you had a legal partner in the property, a co-owner of record, it complicates their options considerably." He paused. "I have the cash to be that partner. I've been saving contract earnings for 6 years with no particular plan for them, and buying into a legitimate landholding in this area is about as good a use as I can think of right now." Lena looked at him steadily. "Is that all you're proposing? A legal partnership?" He met her gaze. "No," he said, "but I'm trying to say the practical part first because the other part is harder to say without it sounding like something it isn't." "Say the other part," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The lantern on the work table put a warm, unsteady light across the space between them. Outside, something moved in the scrubland. A night animal, small, unhurried. "I haven't wanted to stay somewhere in a long time," he said. "A specific somewhere. Most places I've been, I was there for a job and then I was somewhere else." He looked at his bandaged hand, then at her. I've been sitting in this cabin for over a week, and I haven't once wanted to be somewhere else. That's not a small thing for me." The cabin was quiet. "That's a strange way to propose marriage," she said. "I know it is." Most men would have started with the personal part and hoped the practical followed. Most men haven't spent as long as I have watching things get complicated when the practical part isn't solid. He paused. "I'm not trying to be unromantic. I'm trying to be honest about why I think this would work, which includes the fact that I don't think I've been this honest with anyone in about 4 years, and that's not something I'm inclined to walk away from." She looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away. "I'm not easy to be around," she said finally. "I've been told that." "By who?" "Various people who wanted me to be easier." "That's not a character flaw," he said. "That's a description of other people's preferences." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. "The syndicate will use it," she said. "They'll say you're connected to me to undermine your credibility. They'll make it part of their story about both of us." "I know. It'll make things harder. Most things worth doing are harder than the alternative." He paused. "Do you want more time to think about it?" "No," she said. "I've made faster decisions on less information and been right." She looked at him squarely. "Yes, on both the legal partnership and the other part. But I want it understood between us that I'm not a person who does things for appearances. And if this is going to work, it needs to be the same for you." "Agreed," he said. "And I'm going to keep running my work the way I've been running it. I'd be concerned if you didn't. And I'm not going to suddenly start deferring to your judgment on things I know better than you." "That seems correct," he said. "Given that you know this town and I don't, that'll be most things." The almost smile appeared again. She stood up, moved to the small shelf near the window where she kept things she actually wanted rather than things she needed, and came back with 2 cups and a bottle of something that wasn't coffee. "Then we should probably drink to it," she said, "since that's what people do." Gideon made the announcement in the street. He did it with intention, which Lena understood even as it made the skin at the back of her neck prickle. A quiet arrangement made in private gave the syndicate room to work around it. A public declaration did something different. It forced a response, made everything visible at once, and gave the people watching something to orient themselves around. Good tactics weren't always comfortable ones. He said it simply. Standing outside the general store on a Thursday morning when enough of Red Ash was out and about to carry the information effectively. He said that he and Lena Rowan were entering into a business and personal partnership, that they intended to marry, and that he was registering a co-ownership stake in the Rowan property with the Territorial Land Office that afternoon. The reaction was immediate. Hattie Morrow, standing 15 feet away with a parcel under her arm, went a particular color that Lena had never seen a face go before. Claire Oates said nothing but turned and walked in the other direction with considerable purpose. Dorothea Finch, who was not present but would hear about it within the hour, sent a note to Gideon's rented room at the boarding house that afternoon. He showed it to Lena that evening. It said, in careful handwriting, that she hoped he would reconsider before making a decision that could reflect poorly on his standing in the community. He used it to level a table leg that had been wobbling and said nothing further about it. What Lena noticed more than the society reactions was the other kind, quieter, less obvious. Tom Briggs caught her eye across the street and gave her a small nod that meant something she didn't have the precise translation for, but understood was positive. One of the Vasquez brothers, Eduardo, came by the cabin 2 days later under the pretext of asking about a remedy for a muscle injury, and stayed to talk for 40 minutes about nothing directly relevant until he finally said, carefully, "There are people in this town who'd like to see the land situation handled properly, not just me and my brother." "I know," Lena said. "If someone was organizing that kind of effort," he said, "my brother and I would want to be in those conversations." "That's good to hear," she said. "I'll be in touch." But the syndicate wasn't waiting for anyone to organize anything. The morning after Gideon's announcement, Lena walked out to her garden and found the south fence section had been cut in the night. Nothing in the garden had been touched, not yet, but the message was plain enough. The next 3 days were quiet in the way that bad weather is quiet just before it arrives. On the 4th day, she found the yarrow trampled. She stood at the edge of the garden and looked at it, 50 square feet of plants she'd been tending for 3 years. flattened by something heavy and deliberate. Not an accident, not an animal. Every stem bent the same direction, which meant something wide had been dragged through it, or something heavy had been walked through it by someone who wanted her to understand exactly what kind of message they were capable of sending. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was a different matter. She crouched down and started checking the stems. Some were salvageable, bent but not broken. Some weren't. She worked through it methodically, her jaw set, and she was still crouching there 20 minutes later when Gideon came down the path and stopped at the gate. He looked at the garden, then at her face. "How bad?" he said. "The yarrow section. Maybe a quarter of what I had." She stood. "Some of it will come back. Some of it won't." He came through the gate and crouched where she'd been crouching, looking at the damage with the same careful attention he gave everything when he was reading a situation. "They wanted you to know they can reach you here," he said. "I know what they wanted." "Are you scared?" She considered the question seriously, the way he'd asked it seriously, without the dismissive "of course not" she might have said to someone asking it more casually. "Yes," she said. "I'm also angry. The angry is bigger right now." He stood. "Good," he said. "Angry is more useful." "I need to go see Tom Briggs today," she said. "And the Vasquez brothers." "I'll go to Potts," he said. "It's time." She nodded, looked at the flattened yarrow once more, made herself look at it long enough to remember it properly, to let it settle into somewhere that would stay. Then she took off her garden gloves and went to get her coat. The syndicate had made their position clear. Now it was time to make hers. Potts was 71 years old, walked with a cane he didn't actually need most of the time, and had an opinion about everything, which he shared with the particular freedom of a man who had decided that, at his age, politeness was optional. He lived at the east end of town in a house so thoroughly covered in maps that you couldn't find the walls beneath them. Survey maps, topographical sketches, hand-drawn property boundaries going back to the earliest days of Red Ash's settlement. When Gideon knocked on his door, Potts opened it, looked him up and down and said, "You're the tracker who's been riding my roads at 5 in the morning." "That's me," Gideon said. "Come in. I've been wondering when someone was going to come talk to me." The old man made coffee that was strong enough to dissolve a nail and spread 3 maps across his kitchen table without being asked. He already knew about the fencing at the headwaters, had ridden out to look at it 2 weeks ago before Gideon had found it. "It's not on any valid land title I've seen," Potts said, pointing to a section of the largest map with a finger bent sideways from decades of drafting work. "This stretch here, all the way from Markerstone Creek to the North Fork, has been common use since before the town was properly platted. Whoever filed for it filed with something that isn't worth the paper it's printed on, in my professional opinion." "Could you say that in front of a land commissioner?" Gideon asked. "I could say it in front of anyone who'll listen." Potts looked at him over the rim of his coffee cup. "Question is whether anyone who matters is listening." Gideon told him about Duranville, the land commissioner's office, different jurisdiction. Potts was quiet for a moment, drumming his bent finger against the map. "I know a man in Duranville," he said slowly. "Land office deputy commissioner, named Aldrich. He's not corrupt. I'd know if he was. I've been dealing with these offices for 30 years. He paused. "But he's also not going to move on word alone. He needs documentation, surveyed evidence, filed properly, with witness affidavits to back it up. How long to put that together? For me to do it right? 3 weeks? Maybe 4. "We might not have 4 weeks," Gideon said. "Then we might have to do it in 2 and hope it's tight enough to hold." Potts folded his arms across his chest and regarded Gideon with the steady assessment of a man who'd seen a lot of situations and developed reliable instincts about which ones were going to get worse before they got better. "You understand that if I start filing formal surveys against properties that operation has claimed, they're going to know who filed them." "I know. And you're prepared for what that means." "I am," Gideon said. "Are you?" Potts picked up his coffee again. "Son, I'm 71 years old and I own my house outright, and I have no family they can threaten. The only thing I've got left that matters to me is my professional reputation and my right to tell the truth about what I've measured." He took a long drink. "They picked the wrong county to run this in, as far as I'm concerned." Lena, meanwhile, was having a different kind of conversation. She'd gone to see Tom Briggs at his smithy, where the sound of hammer on iron meant their conversation would be covered by noise from all directions. Tom was a practical man who needed practical reasons, so she gave him the water rights situation first. Clean, factual, the math of what losing creek access meant for every small operation in the eastern half of the settlement. He listened while he worked, which was his way. When she finished, he set down his hammer. "I've been watching the Hendricks land," he said. "I know what they're doing to May." "She's aware," Lena said. "She's with us." "Who else?" "The Vasquez brothers, Potts, a few others still deciding." She paused. "It's not nothing, Tom. But we need more than names. We need people willing to stand somewhere visible when the time comes." Tom wiped his hands on his leather apron and looked at her with the particular directness of a man who'd spent his life making things that either held weight or didn't, and had little patience for things that didn't. "I've been in this town 14 years, he said. "I've watched 4 families get run out in the last 2. I told myself it wasn't my problem each time, and I've been wrong about that each time." He picked up his hammer again, turned it once in his hand. "Tell me what you need." She needed his building. The smithy was the largest covered space in Red Ash that wasn't owned by someone connected to Dorothea Finch's social circle. She needed it for a meeting, small enough not to draw attention, large enough to hold the people she was trying to bring together. Tom gave it to her without negotiation. The meeting happened 4 days later on a Tuesday evening when the smithy was dark and the street outside was quiet. 7 people came. May Hendricks, Tom Briggs, Eduardo and Rafael Vasquez, the feed store owner whose name was Gerald Fitch, the bathhouse operator, Nora Sweeney, and Old Potts, who arrived last and immediately went to examine the walls with the air of a man evaluating structural integrity. Gideon stood near the back. He'd suggested that Lena run the meeting. "They trust you," he'd said. "They've known you for years. I'm still a stranger to most of them, regardless of what I announced in the street." She'd almost argued with him on principle, because it felt like the kind of deference she hadn't asked for and didn't need. But she'd recognized it wasn't deference, it was accuracy. He was right. So she stood at the front of the room and told them everything. It took 30 minutes. When she finished, the smithy was quiet except for the wind working at the roof seam and Potts tapping his cane once on the dirt floor. "What exactly is the plan?" Nora Sweeney asked. She was a direct woman who ran her business with the precision of someone who understood that in Red Ash, a woman operating alone had to be twice as organized as a man to be taken half as seriously. "Not the goal, the plan." 2 tracks, Lena said. "First track, legal. Potts files proper surveys on the contested land at the headwaters. We collect witness statements from anyone willing to give them, and we get that documentation to the land commissioner in Duranville through someone Potts knows there. That's our formal challenge to their property claims." "That takes time," Eduardo Vasquez said. "Yes. Which is why there's a second track." She glanced at Gideon briefly, then back to the room. "We make ourselves less vulnerable in the meantime. If the syndicate's power comes from controlling land and water access, we build something they can't easily cut off." "What does that mean practically?" Gerald Fitch asked. "It means the Rowan property becomes more than a homestead," she said. "We have grazing land that's been sitting underused because I didn't have the capital to develop it. Gideon does. We build a working ranch operation, but not cattle, not in direct competition with what the syndicate controls." She'd been thinking about this for 2 weeks, since before the meeting, since before the Yarrow was trampled, maybe since before she'd known exactly what the threat was. Medicine, livestock remedies, preserved food, things the frontier settlements need that currently have to come from far enough away that the cost is significant. If we create a reliable local supply, we build trade relationships with neighboring settlements. Those relationships give us allies. They also give us income streams that aren't dependent on the syndicate's goodwill. The room was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant build," May Hendricks said carefully. She wasn't being dismissive, she was being practical, which was a thing Lena had come to respect about her. "Workers, materials, time. I know. Where do the workers come from?" "Some will come from here," Lena said. "People who need work and don't have reason to be loyal to the syndicate." She paused. "And some will come from the families who've already sold. I've been tracking where they went. 3 of the 5 families are within a day's ride. People who lost their land to this operation might have opinions about helping to fight it. May looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at the floor, then back up. My oldest son is 12, she said. He's been helping me run the ranch since his father died. He's better with animals than most grown men I know. She paused. I'm not asking you to hire a child. I'm telling you that if you need people who know livestock and aren't afraid of long days, I know where to find them. I know you do, Lena said. I was hoping you'd say that. The meeting ran another hour and a half. By the end of it, nothing was certain and nothing was clean. Gerald Fitch wasn't sure he could risk open involvement without jeopardizing his store's supply lines, which went through a distributor who had a relationship with the syndicate. They'd have to work around that. Nora Sweeney had concerns about the timeline for the legal track that Potts couldn't entirely resolve. The Vasquez brothers had questions about the property lines on the grazing land that required another hour of work with Potts's maps to answer adequately. But when people left the smithy that night, they left differently than they'd arrived. Something had shifted in the room around the 40-minute mark, when Eduardo Vasquez had asked a sharp question about the creek fencing, and Potts had answered it by spreading his map on Tom Briggs's anvil block and showing in precise and professional detail exactly what had been built where and why it was illegal. Seeing evidence laid out in a specific and verifiable way did something to people that general statements about injustice didn't. It made the abstract concrete. It made the enemy something with edges you could push against. Lena walked home that night through cold that had sharpened overnight into something serious, her coat pulled close, her mind running through the list of things that needed to happen in what order. The path from Tom's smithy to her cabin took her past the edge of the garden. She didn't stop, but she looked at it in the dark. The trampled yarrow section, already showing the first signs of recovery at the roots. The work that followed was the hardest 3 weeks of Lena's life, and later she would remember it as also the most clarifying. She'd run her own operation for years, but always small, always within the boundaries of what one person could manage with 2 hands and a clear head. What they were building now was different in kind, not just scale. It required her to trust people with pieces of the work she couldn't directly supervise, which went against everything her years of working alone had built into her. The grazing land behind the cabin had to be cleared of scrub brush and assessed for what it could actually support. Gideon hired 2 men from town for the heavy clearing work, men Tom Briggs vouched for, and worked alongside them with his healed hand, slower than he'd have been before the injury, and visibly frustrated about it on days when the work demanded more grip strength than he yet had. One of those mornings, he was wrestling a fence post into ground that was rockier than the surface had suggested, and the post slipped, and he caught it badly with his right hand, and she heard him from 20 feet away make a sound that was tightly controlled and still unmistakably painful. She walked over. "Let me see it," she said. It's fine." "It's not fine, that's why you made that sound." She held out her hand. He gave her his, reluctantly, with the expression of a man who found being tended to more uncomfortable than the injury itself. She examined it quickly. No new damage. The healed tissue had held, just strained. "Take a break," she said. "I don't need—" "The post will still be here in 20 minutes," she said. "Take a break." He took a break. He sat on a fence rail and drank water and watched her go back to what she'd been doing, which was directing Rafael Vasquez on the layout of the first medicinal plant beds in the new section of expanded garden. And the expression on his face during that 20 minutes was something she didn't observe directly, but that Rafael mentioned to her later, with a grin he didn't bother hiding. "That man," Rafael said, "looks at you like you're the most interesting problem he's ever had to figure out." "That's a very specific thing to notice," Lena said. "I'm a very observant person," Rafael said, and went back to work. The medicine production side moved faster than the construction, because Lena knew exactly what she was doing and had 3 years of supply already growing in the original garden. She began processing batches of the remedies she made most regularly. Wound salves, fever preparations, the digestive compounds that traveling workers needed more than most people realized, and started building inventory that went beyond her usual small-scale sales. It was Nora Sweeney who made the first trade connection. Nora had a cousin in the settlement of Bright Creek, 2 days south, who ran a general store, and that cousin sent word that yes, reliable local medicinal supplies at fair prices were very much wanted, And when could she expect a first shipment? "We're not ready to ship yet," Lena said. "Tell her 2 weeks," Nora said. "It'll make her commit to the relationship before someone else does." 2 weeks is aggressive. So is being threatened off your own property. 2 weeks. They shipped in 9 days, which Lena considered her finest logistical achievement to date, and which left her with 2 days of needing to sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch. The trade connection to Bright Creek was the first thread, but threads had a way of pulling on other threads. The Bright Creek store owner mentioned their source to a ranch operation 50 miles east that had been dealing with a livestock illness no one in their area had been able to effectively treat. Rafael Vasquez knew what the illness was. He dealt with it in the herd he and his brother had managed years before, and Lena had a preparation for it. They sent a supply, with instructions, and waited. Word came back 10 days later. The treatment had worked. The ranch operation sent a payment that was more than they'd asked, and with it, a letter asking what else they produced and whether they'd be interested in a standing arrangement. Gideon read the letter twice. Then he set it down on the work table and looked at Lena with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the almost smile, not the empty steadiness, but something open in it, something that was close to wonder. "You built this," he said. "We built it," she said. "Don't get poetic about it. There's still a shipment to prepare." But she felt it too. The thing taking shape was real in a way that plans usually weren't, and it was getting more real every day. Which was, of course, when the syndicate decided they'd waited long enough. The raid came on a Thursday morning before sunrise, when the air was cold enough to see your breath, and the light was still that particular gray that made distances uncertain. Lena heard it before she saw it. The sound of horses moving fast, more than two, coming from the south road. She was already awake, had been awake for an hour, had been sitting at the work table reviewing Potts's latest survey notes that had arrived the previous evening. She got to the window in time to see the torchlight. There were 6 of them, and they moved with the organized efficiency of men who'd done this kind of thing before and found it straightforward. 2 went directly to the new outbuilding where the first season's supply inventory was stored. 1 went to the small cattle pen where the Vasquez brothers had moved 3 of their animals 2 days earlier for easier care during a minor illness. 2 more moved toward the expanded garden section, and 1 stayed on his horse in the middle of it all, watching, which was the one that frightened her most. Because men who watched while others worked had a different relationship to violence than the men doing the work. She didn't have time to be afraid in the way fear usually worked. She had time to think. She grabbed the box from under the floorboard, the property deed, Gideon's co-ownership registration, Potts's survey notes, and put it in the oilskin bag she kept for weather emergencies. And she was out the back door and running toward Tom Briggs's place before the first torch touched anything. She'd been afraid, but she'd been afraid and moved anyway, and there was a difference that mattered. Gideon had heard it too. He'd been sleeping at the cabin. They weren't married yet. The practical matters hadn't caught up with the announcement, and he'd taken the back room that had been her grandfather's. And he came out the front door at almost the same moment she left through the back. And what he saw made him go still for exactly 1 second, in the way he went still when he was calculating something fast. Then he went for the horse. What happened in the next hour was not clean or organized or heroic in any of the ways stories made things heroic. Gideon rode hard toward the mountain road that he'd calculated the syndicate would use for retreat, because it was the only road wide enough for a loaded wagon, and it headed toward the territory where Galt's operation was centered. He was right about the road. He was not right about what he'd be riding into. There were more men than the 6 at the property, a second group waiting at the road junction with the stolen cattle, and 2 of the ranch workers who'd been on the property that morning and who were being held zip-tied with rope on the ground beside the wagon. Gideon pulled up his horse and looked at the situation with the particular clarity of a man who'd learned to assess bad odds quickly and honestly. The odds were bad. He was 1 man on a tired horse against at least 10 men who'd had the night to prepare. He did what he could, which was not nothing, but was also not enough to end it. Lena, meanwhile, had reached Tom Briggs's place, and Tom had gone for the Vasquez brothers, and within 40 minutes there were 9 people moving back toward the Rowan property with buckets and wet blankets and the grim efficiency of people who understood that fire didn't negotiate. They saved the cabin. The outbuilding was gone. The new garden expansion was damaged, but not destroyed. The cattle were already on the mountain road. It was Eduardo Vasquez who organized the initial group into something resembling a defense when the 6 men came back, which they did. Lena had half expected them to be done, and she was wrong about that. They came back with specific instructions, she realized later. Not just destruction, control. The man who'd stayed on his horse wanted them to know they could come back whenever they chose. What he hadn't counted on was Nora Sweeney arriving with a rifle she turned out to know how to use, and Gerald Fitch behind her with 2 more men from the feed store, and May Hendricks' oldest son who was 12 years old and not supposed to be there at all, but who had ridden in alone in the dark because he'd seen the torchlight from the Hendricks ranch and made his own decision about what it meant. The 6 men pulled back, not defeated, just recalculating. In the gray morning light, with smoke still rising from where the outbuilding had been and the cattle gone, and 2 workers with rope burns on their wrists sitting against the cabin wall drinking water, Lena stood in the middle of her property and looked at the people around her. Tom Briggs, soot on his face. May Hendricks with her arm around her 12-year-old son, who was trying to look like he hadn't just terrified her by showing up in the middle of a raid. The Vasquez brothers, Rafael with a long cut on his forearm from something she'd need to look at. Nora with her rifle still in her hands. Gerald Fitch, who'd been on the fence about visible involvement, standing there anyway. She would need to treat Rafael's arm. She would need to make an accounting of what was lost and what was salvageable. She would need to find Gideon, who wasn't back yet, and that absence was sitting in her chest in a way she was not going to examine until she could afford to. But before any of that, she stood in the early light and she looked at the people who had come. Not because she'd forced them, not because they had nowhere else to be. They had come because they decided to, which was different from every other kind of showing up there was. She didn't say anything about it. She went to get her medical bag and she started on Rafael's arm, and the morning came up gray and cold around all of them. Gideon came back 2 hours after sunrise, on foot, leading his horse by the reins. The horse had thrown a shoe on the mountain road in the dark, and he'd walked it back rather than risk the animal on loose rock. He was dirty and cold, and there was a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled enough to dry in a dark line down the side of his face. And when he came through the gate and saw Lena standing in the yard, he stopped walking for a moment. She crossed to him, took the horse's reins without saying anything, checked the animal's near foreleg, handed the reins to Eduardo Vasquez, who happened to be standing nearby, and then turned to Gideon and looked at his face with the same focused attention she gave every injury. "Sit down," she said. "I'm fine. You have a head cut, and you've been walking for 2 hours on a cold mountain road. Sit down." He sat on the porch step. She cleaned the cut, which was shallow but had bled dramatically the way head wounds did, and closed it with 2 strips of cloth she tied off without ceremony. He sat still for it, which she'd learned was his way of accepting help. Not graciously, not with any performance of gratitude, just without resistance, which from him meant the same thing. "The cattle?" she asked. "Gone. They had a wagon waiting. They were moving fast." He paused. "I got close enough to see the operation. There were more men than we thought, at least 15 total, probably more staged further up the road. And the 2 workers they took? That's the part I need to tell you." He looked at her directly. "I found them on the road. They'd been cut loose before I reached the junction, left on the road without horses." He paused. "They weren't seriously hurt. I think it was deliberate. Let them walk back with a message." "What message?" "That they can take what they want and leave witnesses to it, that they're not afraid of us knowing." He looked at the remains of the outbuilding, still sending up thin threads of smoke in the morning cold. "This wasn't meant to finish us. It was meant to show us they can reach us whenever they decide to." Lena sat down on the step beside him. Not close, but close enough. "Potts sent a letter yesterday," she said. "Before all of this, Aldrich in Duranville has the survey documentation. He's reviewing it." She looked at the yard, at the people moving around in it, Tom Briggs helping the 2 freed workers get settled, Rafael with his bandaged forearm directing his brother on salvaging what remained of the supply inventory from the outbuilding's edges. "Potts says Aldrich is taking it seriously, but he needs one more thing." "What thing?" "The original contracts, the forged property filings." She turned to look at him. "Not copies. The originals, or at least certified testimony from someone who handled them directly." She paused. You saw documents at Galt's operation before you had to run. I took some of them, he said. She went still. You have them? I had them. I hid them before I rode into Red Ash because I didn't know yet if this town was safe. He looked at her steadily. They're in a watertight case in a rock outcropping about 4 miles north. I've been waiting for the right moment to retrieve them, which I kept not finding. The morning was quiet around them for a moment. I think the moment might be now, she said. Tet. They rode north together, just the two of them, while the others stayed at the property. The rock outcropping was where he'd described it, a distinctive double formation of pale limestone that would be easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, which was why he'd chosen it. He reached into a gap between the stones and pulled out a flat leather case sealed with a waxed clasp. Inside were 8 documents. Some were partial, pages torn or water-blurred at the edges from his 3 days in the mountains before arriving in Red Ash. But 4 of them were intact, and when Lena looked at them on the ride back, holding them carefully against the movement of the horse, she could see exactly what they were. Property transfer agreements. 3 of them bore names she recognized. The Pratt family, the Colsons, Old Wheeler. The numbers on the agreements were not the numbers those families had been told they would receive. The discrepancy in Wheeler's case was enough to make her jaw tighten. The 4th document was different. It was a letter, signed with a name she didn't recognize at the bottom, but the content laid out the operation in terms that were operational rather than legal. Who controlled what decisions, who received what portion of the proceeds, which county officials had been approached, and what they'd agreed to in exchange for what. You read this? She asked. On the mountain, he said. Before everything went wrong. The name at the bottom. Harlan Voss, he said. I've been trying to figure out who Voss is since I read it. Galt isn't the top of this. Galt's a manager. She looked at the signature again. Thought about Dorothea Finch's note to Gideon, written in careful handwriting. Thought about the land office where Finch had met with syndicate riders. Thought about the way Finch had been present in every peripheral corner of the situation without ever being directly in the middle of it. Voss is a married name, Lena said slowly. Dorothea's maiden name was Dorothea Voss, before she married Finch. Gideon turned to look at her. Harlan Voss, Lena said, is her brother. The decision about what to do next took one evening of hard conversation and one morning of harder preparation. Potts, when they brought him the documents that same afternoon, sat with them for a long time without speaking. He examined each one with the methodical care of a man who understood what he was looking at and what it meant professionally and legally. And when he finally set them down, he looked at Gideon and Lena over the rims of his eyeglasses. These are enough, he said. Combined with my survey documentation and the affidavits I've collected, these are enough for Aldrich to move on. He paused. But you understand what moving on means in this context. A territorial commissioner doesn't send a notice in the mail. He sends a hearing. And a hearing means both sides present evidence in front of witnesses. We know, Gideon said, which means the syndicate will know a hearing is coming before it happens, which gives them time to destroy additional evidence, move assets, or... Potts paused carefully. Other options. We know that too, Lena said, which is why we're not mailing this to Duranville. Someone is writing there directly, today. The someone was Eduardo Vasquez, who had no property for the syndicate to threaten and who could ride harder than anyone else in their group. They spent an hour with him going over what to say to Aldrich and what to hand over, and in what order. And then he left with the documents in the same oilskin bag Lena had used to save them from the raid, and she didn't breathe entirely normally until he was out of sight on the south road. That left the question of the mountain pass, which Gideon had been turning over since dawn. The syndicate had moved stolen cattle and forged records to a staging point near the pass. Gideon was certain of this based on what he'd seen on the mountain road. If they were going to consolidate their operation and move it to territory outside Aldrich's jurisdiction, the pass was the route. The window before they could organize that kind of move was days, not weeks. He laid it out for the group that evening in Tom Briggs's smithy, now their de facto meeting space, familiar enough that people found their usual places without thinking about it. If the documentation reaches Aldrich and he moves on a hearing, Voss and Galt will know within a day or two, he said. They have enough connections and enough offices that word will travel. When they know, they'll run, but they won't run empty-handed. They'll try to take the physical records, the stolen livestock, whatever liquid assets the operation has accumulated. The pass is the only practical route. So we go to the pass, Tom Briggs said. We go to the pass, Gideon confirmed, but not to fight. We don't have the numbers to fight, and fighting isn't the point. He paused. The point is witnesses. Hundreds of them, from as many neighboring settlements as we can reach in the next 48 hours. If the syndicate tries to run with stolen property and forged records, they do it in front of enough people that there's no version of events they can construct afterward. The room sat with that. You want to make it impossible to cover up, May Hendricks said. A corrupt sheriff can bury a complaint from 7 people in Red Ash, Gideon said. He can't bury a complaint from 300 people from 4 settlements who all saw the same thing at the same time. 48 hours, Nora Sweeney said, to reach settlements and get people moving. The Bright Creek connection, Lena said, looking at Nora. I'll send my cousin a rider tonight, Nora said immediately. The ranch operation east of Bright Creek, the one we supplied the livestock remedy to, Lena said. Raphael, can you reach them? By morning, Raphael said. They planned through the night. Not cleanly. There were arguments about timing and route and what to do if the syndicate moved sooner than expected. And Gerald Fitch had a long and somewhat circular discussion about the risk to his supply lines that eventually resolved into him agreeing to come, but maintaining the right to say afterward that he'd been uncertain about it. May's 12-year-old son, whose name was James and who had apparently decided that his role in the raid defense had qualified him for full participation in strategy discussions, offered 2 suggestions about the past geography that turned out to be correct, because he'd been riding those roads since he was 8. Lena went home at midnight and slept for 4 hours, which was not enough but was what was available. The pass was a natural bottleneck in the mountain road, half a day's ride north of Red Ash, where the terrain narrowed between 2 steep faces of rock, and the road became the only practical route for a loaded wagon. Gideon had tracked men through terrain like this before, and he understood both its tactical value and its particular discomforts. The wind came through the gap at an angle that found every opening in your clothing, and the light was strange in the late afternoon, half the pass in shadow and half in the low sun's last intensity. They arrived before the syndicate, which was the plan, and the people from Bright Creek and the Eastern Ranch operation arrived within an hour of each other. And by the time the afternoon light started to drop, there were close to 250 people gathered at and around the pass entrance. Not armed, mostly, or not conspicuously, just present, watching. The syndicate's convoy came up the road at 4 in the afternoon. Gideon had positioned himself at the front of the gathered crowd, visible, which was a choice. The man riding at the head of the convoy, a heavy-set man on a gray horse who Gideon recognized from the documents as one of Galt's senior managers, pulled up when he saw what was in front of him and sat his horse for a long moment. Then Galt himself came forward from the middle of the convoy. He was a smaller man than Gideon had expected from his reputation, neat, composed, wearing the kind of clothes that communicated prosperity without shouting it. He looked at the crowd with the expression of a man recalculating. Cross, he said, recognizing Gideon. Galt, Gideon said. You're in the way. I'm not, actually. You can ride through any time you'd like. Gideon's voice was conversational. What you can't do is take the cattle, the forged property records, or Harlan Voss's correspondence with you when you go. A silence moved through the crowd. Galt's composed expression didn't break, but something shifted behind it. I don't know what you think you have. You know exactly what I have, Gideon said. I had it on the mountain 6 weeks ago, and you sent a man to get it back, and that didn't go the way you planned. He paused. The documentation is in Duranville. The land commissioner's office has it. A hearing has been requested. He said it without drama, the way you stated a fact about weather. What's in your wagons right now is evidence. If you leave it here, you leave it as people returning property they had no right to take. If you try to take it through this pass, everyone watching makes a statement about what they saw. Galt looked at the crowd. 250 faces, ranchers, townspeople, workers, none of them moving, none of them making noise. just watching with the particular focused attention of people who understood they were present at something that would have consequences. "You can't hold us here," Galt said. "No," Gideon agreed. "I can't. Leave or stay. That's your choice." It was the choice that was the thing. Gideon had understood this from the beginning, had explained it to Lena on the ride north, and she'd understood it immediately, which was one of the things about her that he kept finding himself grateful for. You couldn't defeat something like this syndicate with force. They had more force. You had to make the cost of continuing higher than the benefit of stopping. You had to make it public and witnessed and inescapable. Galt sat his horse for a long moment. Behind him, Lena could see movement in the convoy. Men talking quietly to each other. Men looking at the crowd the way the crowd was looking at them. Men doing their own calculations about what they'd personally signed on for and whether this particular outcome was included in that agreement. It wasn't, for most of them. She could see it happen in real time, the slow withdrawal of men who'd been paid for intimidation and fraud and had not been paid for standing in front of 250 witnesses while someone read out their employer's correspondence with the territorial commissioner's office. 3 men at the convoy's edges simply turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come. Then 2 more. Then a group of 4. Galt watched them go. His face was controlled, but the control was costing him something visible. What happened next was not what Lena had planned for, because she hadn't planned for it at all. A shot came from somewhere in the middle of the convoy, not aimed at anyone, fired up into the air, which was either a signal or a panic response, or something else entirely. The crowd shifted, and several horses startled, and in the confusion, a wagon driver near the convoy's rear tried to turn his vehicle, and managed instead to jackknife it across the road, and 2 of the men riding beside it went down when horses collided. Lena was moving before she'd made a conscious decision to move. One of the downed men was caught under a horse. Not crushed, the horse had scrambled up fast, but he'd hit the road surface at an angle that told her immediately there was something wrong with the shoulder and possibly the collarbone. The second man was on his feet but had taken a hoof. Glancing blow to the upper arm, and the way he was holding it told her the arm was broken. These were syndicate men, men who'd been part of burning her outbuilding, taking her workers, trampling her yarrow. The man with the broken arm had a brand on his saddle she recognized from Gideon's description of the raid operation. She knelt beside the one on the ground anyway. "Don't move your right side," she said. "Can you hear me?" He looked up at her with an expression she didn't have time to interpret. "Yeah." "What's your name?" "Clyde." "All right, Clyde. This is going to hurt for a minute, and then it's going to hurt less." She worked on him in the middle of the road while the situation reorganized itself around her, while Gideon talked Galt down from whatever the next escalation might have been, while Tom Briggs and the Vasquez brothers moved to secure the convoy vehicles, while the crowd held its position with the steadiness of people who'd decided before they came that they were going to hold it. The man with the broken arm came and stood nearby, watching her work on his colleague, and after a minute he said quietly, "You're the woman from Red Ash, the herb woman." "That's me," she said. "They said you were—" He stopped. "I know what they said." She didn't look up. "Come here, let me look at your arm." He came. She examined it, confirmed the break, immobilized it with what she had in her bag, and told him he needed a proper doctor for the setting and that if he rode with it unsupported, he would make it significantly worse. He looked at her for a moment. "Why are you helping us?" She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He was young, younger than she'd first thought, maybe 22, 23. He had the look of someone who'd signed on to something without fully understanding what it was. "Because you're hurt," she said. "That's the whole reason." Galt did not run. That surprised her later when she thought about it. He sat his horse in the road while his operation dissolved around him. Men leaving, the wagon situation sorting itself into syndicate property, staying put, and the livestock being held by Tom Briggs and Raphael. And when it was clear that the momentum had entirely shifted, he looked at Gideon with something that was close to recognition. Not respect exactly, more like the acknowledgement of one professional for another. "The document's in Duranville," he said. "Voss's letter is in there." "Yes." "Then Voss is the one who should be here, not me." He said it without particular bitterness, just factually. "I was hired management. He's the principal." I know, Gideon said. Tell that to Aldrich's office. I intend to. Galt looked around at the road, at the gathered crowd, at the convoy that had shrunk to its remaining loyal handful. You were thorough, he said. I'll give you that. Lena Rowan was thorough, Gideon said. I just know how to find things. Galt glanced toward Lena, who was still with her two patients on the side of the road. Something moved across his expression. Not remorse, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The particular discomfort of a man who'd professionalized the harm he did and was now in the presence of someone who'd professionalized something else entirely. He didn't say anything else. He dismounted, handed his horse's reins to the man beside him, and sat down on a rock by the side of the road and waited for whatever came next. Dorothea Finch was in the land office when the rider from Duranville arrived in Red Ash the following afternoon. Lena heard about it afterward from Nora Sweeney, who had been present on the street when it happened. Aldrich had moved faster than any of them had expected. Eduardo had clearly been persuasive, or the documents had spoken for themselves, or both. The rider carried a formal notice of investigation and a cease and desist on all property transfers associated with the syndicate's operation, and he walked into the land office and served it to Dorothea Finch directly. She had, by all accounts, received it with considerable dignity, which Lena found she could almost admire in a removed sort of way. Whatever Dorothea Finch was, she was not a woman who fell apart in public. But the notice was served, and the investigation was opened, and the forged property records were now evidence in a formal proceeding, and the 5 families who'd sold under duress were named in a restitution provision that Potts had apparently insisted on including. Tom Briggs heard the news on the street and came to tell Lena and found her in the garden, replanting the yarrow section that had been trampled 3 weeks earlier. He stood at the gate and told her what had happened, and she listened with her hands in the soil. It's not over, she said when he finished. A notice isn't a verdict. I know that, Tom said, but it's something. It's something, she agreed. She went back to her planting. The roots she was putting in were from divisions of the original plants. Same stock, same ground, going back into the same soil. They'd take. She knew this ground. She'd been working it for 5 years, and she knew what it would and wouldn't hold. Tom stood at the gate for another moment, watching her work. You know, he said, when you first started talking to people about all this, I wasn't sure. I know you weren't. I thought you were taking on something too big. She pressed the last root down and patted the soil around it and looked up at him. You came anyway, she said. He shrugged, with the particular awkwardness of a man not accustomed to being acknowledged directly for doing the right thing. Seemed like the thing to do, he said. She let him have the shrug. It was the truest thing he could have said. Gideon found her in the garden an hour later. He came down the path and stopped at the gate, and she looked at him, and he looked at her across the late afternoon light, with everything that had happened in the past 6 weeks sitting between them. The burned-out building, the mountain road, the mountain pass, the 2 syndicate men she'd treated in the road while the situation resolved itself around her. Aldrich's investigator wants statements from both of us, he said. I know, Potts sent a note this morning. There's going to be a formal hearing, probably in 8 weeks. We'll need to be there. I figured. He opened the gate and came in, which he always did without asking, which had stopped registering to her as notable somewhere around the 3rd week, and had simply become part of how the cabin's gravity worked. He looked at the replanted section. The soil was dark and freshly turned, and the new roots were invisible under it, doing whatever roots did in the dark before they decided to become something visible. You're already replanting, he said. It needed doing. He crouched down and looked at the soil the way he looked at track on a road, reading it, understanding what it told him about what had passed and what was coming. She watched him do it and thought about the first time she'd seen him at her gate, the wrong angle of his arm, the way he'd held himself together through sheer stubbornness. Gideon, she said. He looked up. Your hand, she said. After the mountain road. Let me see it again. He stood and held it out. She took it. The scarred palm, the healed fingers, the particular landscape of what that injury had left behind. She turned it over, checked the range of motion with a few careful pressures, watched his face for the responses he'd learned to keep quiet. It was healed. Not perfectly. The scar tissue had pulled slightly in a way that would limit his grip in cold weather for probably the rest of his life. But healed. She held onto his hand for a moment longer than she needed to, which was the most she'd allowed herself to say about the past 6 weeks that didn't have a practical function, and he let her, which was the most he'd allowed himself to receive. Then she let go and went back to her planting, and he stayed in the garden, and the late light came down across red ash and the scrubland and the distant mountains, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them needed to be somewhere else. The hearing in Duranville took 3 days. Lena had never been to Duranville before, which she found faintly absurd given that it was only 2 days' ride and had been the nearest territorial administrative center for the entirety of her time in Red Ash. She'd never had occasion to go. Her life had been contained within a radius that made sense for what she did. The cabin, the garden, the town, the people who needed what she could provide. Duranville had always been the kind of place you went when the ordinary structures of local life had failed you, which until recently they technically hadn't, just quietly ground against her in ways she'd learned to absorb. She and Gideon rode together. Potts came in a hired buggy because his knees wouldn't take 2 days in a saddle anymore, and he said so without embarrassment, which she appreciated. Eduardo Vasquez came as a witness. May Hendricks came, which meant arranging for James to stay with Tom Briggs for 4 days, which James accepted with the particular resigned dignity of a 12-year-old who understood the importance of something and resented not being part of it in equal measure. The Territorial Land Commissioner's office was a 2-story building on Duranville's main street that smelled like paper and old wood, and the particular institutional staleness of a place where serious things happened slowly. Aldrich was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the manner of someone who had spent so long being careful about facts that carelessness in others genuinely offended him. He shook Potts's hand first, which was correct. The survey documentation was the spine of the case, and everyone knew it. The first day was testimony. Potts presented his surveys, methodical and precise, dismantling the syndicate's filed land claims with the calm authority of a man who'd been measuring ground for 30 years and could tell you exactly why a claim was fraudulent and exactly how he knew. Aldrich asked sharp questions that Potts answered without hedging, and by the afternoon session, Lena could see that the commissioner had already formed his opinion and was building the formal record to support it. Gideon's testimony was the second morning. He was a good witness, specific, unhurried, resistant to the attempts by the syndicate's legal representative to reframe his account as professional grievance against Galt rather than documented observation. He answered questions directly, and when he didn't know something, he said he didn't know it, which was more credible than witnesses who had answers for everything. The syndicate's legal representation was a man named Creel, who was competent and visibly aware that he was working with less than he needed. He tried 3 times to establish that Gideon's personal involvement with Lena constituted a conflict of interest that colored his testimony, and Aldrich shut it down all 3 times with the same flat patience. Lena's testimony was the second afternoon. She'd expected to be nervous. She wasn't, which she put down to the same quality that kept her hand steady during difficult medical procedures. The thing she was doing had a clear purpose, and clear purpose things didn't leave room for the kind of anxiety that came from uncertainty about whether you were doing the right thing. She described the men at her gate. She described the trampled yarrow. She described the morning of the raid, what she'd seen and heard and done. She described the 2 syndicate men she'd treated on the mountain road, including their names as she knew them, because Aldrich wanted specifics, and she had them. Creel asked her, somewhat desperately, whether it was true that she had provided medical treatment to syndicate members during the confrontation at the pass. "Yes," she said. "And you did this despite the fact that these men had been involved in raids against your property?" "I did it because they were injured," she said. "That's what I do." Creel didn't find a useful follow-up question to that and moved on. The verdict, when it came on the 3rd day, was thorough in the way that Aldrich's manner had suggested it would be. All property transfers associated with the syndicate's operation were invalidated. The 5 families who'd sold under duress, the Pratts, the Colsons, Old Wheeler's estate, and 2 others whose names Lena had learned over the course of the investigation, were entitled to restitution at fair market value, funded by a seizure of the syndicate's documented liquid assets. The water rights at the headwaters reverted to common use. Galt and 4 senior members of the operation were referred to territorial criminal authorities. Harlan Voss, who had not attended the hearing and whose absence was conspicuous and legally meaningful, was the subject of a separate warrant that Aldrich said, with careful neutrality, was being actively pursued. Dorothea Finch was not charged. There was not sufficient direct evidence to connect her to the operation's decisions, as opposed to its social facilitation, and Aldrich was precise about the difference. She would face no legal consequences. Lena sat with that on the ride home. She understood it. Aldrich was right that the evidence didn't reach Finch directly, and a case built on inference rather than documentation would have been weaker, not stronger. But understanding the reasoning and finding it entirely satisfying were two different things, and she was honest enough with herself to hold both at once. "She'll stay in Red Ash," she said to Gideon, somewhere on the first day's road home. "Probably," he said, "and we'll see her at the general store." "Probably." She looked at the road ahead. "I can manage that," she said. "I just wanted to say it out loud first." "Makes sense," he said. "Say things out loud before you have to live them." She glanced at him. "Is that a principle you operate by?" "It's one I'm trying to," he said, with the small honesty that she'd come to understand was his version of saying something significant. Red Ash. In the weeks after Duranville was not transformed, Lena would have been suspicious of transformation. Things that changed all at once usually changed back. What happened instead was slower and more real than transformation. A gradual settling, the way ground settles after water moves through it, finding its new level. The Colson family came back first. They'd been living with relatives in a settlement 2 days east, and the moment the restitution was confirmed, they loaded their wagon and came back to a ranch that had been sitting empty for 8 months. The Pratt family followed 2 weeks later. Old Wheeler's son, who'd inherited the estate and the grief of a bad sale made under pressure by a dying man, arrived in Red Ash on a Tuesday morning and stood in front of the Wheeler property for a long time before going inside, and Lena saw him from a distance and didn't intrude on that. The rebuilt outbuilding went up faster than the original because Tom Briggs organized the build, and Tom Briggs was efficient in the way that people who worked with iron were efficient. He understood load-bearing, and he had no patience for approaches that were going to need fixing later. The Vasquez brothers provided lumber from a connection they had 2 settlements over, and James Hendricks, who had apparently negotiated himself into the labor crew through a combination of persistence and demonstrated usefulness, spent 3 consecutive Saturdays helping with the frame. May Hendricks watched her son from a distance one of those Saturdays, standing at the edge of the property with her coffee cup, and Lena stood beside her. "He's going to be something," May said. "He already is something," Lena said. "He rode into a raid in the dark when he was 12 years old because he thought someone needed help. He's also 12 years old and thinks that qualifies him to have opinions about cattle management that override mine." "Well," Lena said, "that part's less impressive." May laughed. A real one, the kind that came from somewhere that had been tight for a while and was finally loosening. It was one of the better sounds Lena heard that month. The wedding happened in November, which was later than either of them had strictly planned for, but the hearing and the rebuilding and the general ongoing nature of trying to run an expanding operation had pushed it down the priority list in a way that neither found particularly troubling. They were already living as partners in every practical sense. The formal ceremony was important for the legal record and for the community's sense of how things stood, and they both understood that, but neither of them was the kind of person who placed the symbol above the substance it was supposed to represent. It was small. Tom Briggs's smithy again, which had become by default the communal space for things that mattered in Red Ash. Its association with hard work and useful purpose, apparently making it appropriate for occasions beyond planning sessions. The people who came were the people who'd been part of everything: May and James, the Vasquez brothers, Nora Sweeney, Gerald Fitch, who'd come through in the end and still maintained his right to say he'd had reservations. Potts, who arrived with his cane and an expression of gruff satisfaction and a gift that turned out to be a framed copy of the original Rowan property survey, the oldest document he had for the land, dated to Lena's grandfather's time. Lena looked at it for a long moment, thought about her grandfather, who had built a cabin on land everyone said was too far from the center of things, who had kept a garden he wasn't sure anyone else would value, who had left it all to her because she was the one who'd been there and the one who would stay. "Thank you," she said to Potts. "Don't thank me," he said. "It's a legal document, not a sentiment." "It's both," she said. He harumphed and went to find the food, which Nora Sweeney had organized with the same precise efficiency she applied to everything, and which was considerably better than the occasion required. Hattie Morrow and Clara Oates were not there. That was fine. Some distances didn't close, and expecting them to was a particular kind of self-deception that Lena had never been inclined toward. Dorothea Finch sent a note. It was correct in its phrasing, which cost her something, Lena suspected, and she acknowledged it by reading it once and setting it aside without anger. People did what they could manage. Sometimes what they could manage was a correct note, and that was its own kind of effort. What Lena remembered most from that evening, later, was not any particular moment but the quality of the room. The sound of people who'd been through something hard together and had come out on the other side of it without pretending the hard part hadn't happened. That was rarer than she'd understood when she was younger. She'd thought that shared difficulty would always produce either closeness or distance, one or the other, clean. What it actually produced was something more complicated. People who knew each other in ways that required no explanation, who carried the same specific memories, who could be in a room together without performing anything. Gideon, at one point in the evening, was standing near the back wall talking to Eduardo Vasquez, and Lena looked at him across the room and thought about the man who'd come through her gate with a broken hand and a 3-day-old wound and the careful stillness of someone who'd spent a long time keeping the volume of things internal. He caught her looking, raised an eyebrow. She shook her head slightly. Nothing, just looking. And he accepted that with the ease of a man who'd learned when to press and when to let a thing be, which was one of his better qualities and one she'd come to rely on. The Healing Center, which was what people eventually started calling the expanded operation, was never quite what Lena had originally sketched out in her mind the night she'd made her first list. It was messier than the plan, and in some ways larger, and in some ways more limited. The medicinal supply side was functioning well and growing. The Bright Creek connection had led to 3 others, and the Eastern Ranch operation had become a reliable ongoing relationship that Rafael Vasquez managed with the steady competence he brought to most things. But the physical center, the space she'd imagined as a proper treatment facility, equipped and staffed, was slower to materialize than she'd hoped because money and time and the sheer volume of immediate need kept redirecting resources. What she had by the following spring was a dedicated treatment room added to the cabin's east side, large enough for 2 patients at once, with proper light and storage, and a work table that was finally sized for the work rather than adapted from something else. It was not what she'd originally imagined. It was what had been possible, built from what was actual rather than what was ideal. She found to her own mild surprise that she preferred it. The gap between imagined and actual had always bothered her in the past. The sense that the real version of a thing was always a diminished form of the intended version. What she was learning, slowly, at a pace that felt like it should have come earlier in her life, was that actual things had a weight and texture that imagined things didn't, and the imperfections in them were often what made them work. She said something like this to Gideon one morning, not sure it would land as anything other than abstract. He thought about it for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. His right hand, the scarred one, with its slightly different grip from what it had been before. "The plan is just how you convince yourself to start," he said. "What you build is what you actually build." "That's reductive," she said. "It's also true." She considered it. "Both things can be right at once," she said. "Usually are," he agreed. James Hendricks turned 13 in February and celebrated it by acquiring, through means his mother was not entirely clear on, a half-broke young horse that he was absolutely certain he could train. May came to Lena about it with the expression of a woman who had survived a raid and a land dispute and a territorial hearing and was not prepared to be defeated by a 13-year-old and a questionable horse. Lena went to look at the horse. It was a leggy bay with good bones and the eye of an animal that had decided it didn't trust people yet, but was open to being persuaded otherwise. "He'll be fine," she told May. "The horse and the boy." "You can't know that." "No," Lena said. "But some things you assess and then you commit to, and you manage what comes up. May looked at her sideways. You're not talking about the horse. I'm talking about the horse, Lena said. I'm also talking about everything else. The horse, as it turned out, took to James with the kind of accelerated trust that occasionally happens between a young animal and a young person who approach each other without pretense. By spring, James was riding it competently. May said nothing about this except that she was not surprised, which meant she was pleased and didn't want to make too much of it. These were the ordinary things, the things that didn't make a story the way raids and hearings made a story, but that were the actual texture of what came after. The days that accumulated into something you could look back on and call a life. Gideon's hand bothered him in cold weather. This was true from the first winter and remained true, a permanent consequence of the original injury and the 3 days he'd spent without treatment and the particular way the scar tissue had laid down in the healing. He never complained about it directly. She knew because she watched his hands the way she watched all things that she'd treated. Not with worry exactly, more with the ongoing attention of someone who understood that healing wasn't a destination, but a condition that required maintenance. On bad mornings, she made a warming compress without being asked and set it at his place at the table, and he used it without comment, and they moved on with the day. This was a form of conversation that required no words, and was, she had decided, one of the more functional ones they had. The scar on his palm had faded to a pale line that was almost invisible in certain lights. In others, it caught the sun in a way that made it clearly legible, a record of a specific event, a specific choice, a specific 3-day ride through mountains that had ended at her gate. She thought sometimes about what the town had made of that choice. The wealthy widows with their comfortable houses and their social calculations, all of them watching him ride down Main Street and deciding immediately what kind of story he was going to be, what role he would play in the structure they'd built around themselves. And him simply not playing it. Not because he was making a statement, just because he saw what he saw and moved toward it, which was, she'd come to understand, the most fundamental thing about him. He was very good at seeing clearly and very bad at pretending he'd seen something else. She'd loved that about him before she'd known she loved anything about him. It had looked at first like detachment. She'd learned the difference. In the spring, a woman arrived in Red Ash with 2 children, a broken-down wagon, and an injury to her wrist that she'd been traveling with for 4 days. She came to Lena's door the way people came now, directly, without the uncertainty of not knowing if the welcome was real. Her name was Clara Pruitt, and she'd come from a settlement 3 days north that had dried up when the water failed, and she had nowhere particular to go except somewhere that wasn't where she'd been. Lena set the wrist, which was fractured and needed proper immobilization, fed the children while she worked, and listened to Clara Pruitt's account of where she'd come from with the attention she gave every patient. Not just the injury, but the whole situation, because the whole situation was always part of the injury. Afterward, while Clara's children were asleep on the cabin's extra cot, Lena sat across from her at the work table and said, "How long can you stay?" Clara looked at her. "I don't have money for—" "I didn't ask about money," Lena said. "I asked how long you can stay." Clara was quiet for a moment. She was the kind of tired that sleep didn't fix, the kind that came from carrying things alone for too long without anyone to share the weight with. Lena recognized it. She'd worn it herself for years in a version that was lower level but the same quality. "I don't know," Clara said. "A while if there's work." "There's work," Lena said. "I need someone to help manage the supply side of what we produce here. It involves a lot of organization and some travel to delivery points. Does that suit you?" Clara looked at her with the wary assessment of someone who'd learned not to trust offers that seemed straightforward. "Why would you do that?" Lena thought about how to answer that honestly. She thought about May Hendricks, who'd sat across a table from her 8 months ago with calculating eyes and a tired face and a ranch held together with stubbornness. She thought about Nora Sweeney and her rifle and her connections. She thought about Tom Briggs, who'd said it seemed like the thing to do, which was as close to a philosophy as most people ever managed to articulate. "Because someone did it for me," she said. "Not with a job offer, with something else. But the principle is the same." She paused. "And because you came to the right door, which took some kind of courage, even if it didn't feel like it." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Her wrist was immobilized and her children were asleep, and outside the cabin window, the spring light was doing what spring light did in this part of the country, coming in low and golden and making the ordinary look briefly like something more. "All right," Clara said. It was the same word Lena had said to Gideon months ago, at a different table in the same cabin, with the same meaning. Not a grand declaration, not a transformation, just a door opening, and someone deciding to walk through it. But the yarrow came back that spring thicker than it had been before the trampling. This was not unusual. Disturbed roots often threw up stronger growth in the season after damage, compensating for what had been lost with a kind of aggressive renewal that looked, if you didn't know better, like the plant had been unaffected. Lena knew better. She'd watched enough damaged things recover to understand that recovery and untouched were not the same state, and that pretending they were did a disservice to everything the plant had done to get back to where it was. She cut the first harvest of the season on a morning in late April when the air was still cool, but the sun was already warm on the back of her neck, working with the efficiency of 5 years of practice and the additional efficiency of knowing exactly what this particular batch was going to become and where it was going to go. Gideon came out of the cabin with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, which was his version of domestic ease. Not comfortable in the showy way, not performing contentment, but present, solid, occupying space in a way that didn't demand acknowledgement and didn't require her to stop what she was doing. She kept cutting. He leaned against the fence and drank his coffee and looked out at the scrubland and the distant suggestion of mountains to the north. And after a while he said, "The Colsons were asking about the livestock remedy supply again. Eduardo says they want a standing monthly arrangement." "Tell him yes," she said. "Same terms as the Bright Creek arrangement." "That's what I thought." He paused. "James Hendricks asked me yesterday if I would teach him tracking." She looked up at that. "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." "He'll be relentless until you give him an answer." "I know." A pause. "I'm going to say yes." She looked at him for a moment, the scarred hand around the coffee cup, the set of his shoulders that she'd learned to read the way she read most things, the specific quality of his silence that meant he'd already decided something and was telling her after rather than before. She'd stopped finding this annoying somewhere around the 2nd month. It was how he was. She was how she was. They managed. "He's a good kid," she said. "He's a determined kid," Gideon said. "Which is better." She went back to her cutting. The yarrow came away clean at the stem, leaving the root system intact, ready to throw up new growth in the weeks following. She worked her way down the row and thought about determined kids and scarred hands and the particular stubbornness of things that grew in difficult ground. Red ash was not transformed. It was not a better place in the clean storybook sense of better. There were still people in it who'd stood by while their neighbors were stolen from, still small corruptions and social cruelties and the ordinary human failures that no hearing could adjudicate. Dorothea Finch was still in the large house at the end of the good street, still the wealthiest person in the settlement, still moving through the social structures she'd spent decades building. Some things didn't change because a verdict went a certain way. But May Hendricks had her ranch. The Colsons had come home. Old Wheeler's son had walked into his father's house and started fixing what needed fixing. Clara Pruitt's children were enrolled in the settlement small school, and Clara herself had turned out to have a gift for logistics that Lena found she could not only rely on but actually trust, which was different from relying on and rarer. And there was a treatment room on the east side of a cabin where anyone who needed help could come and receive it based on need rather than status, and a garden that had been trampled and replanted and was currently producing more than it ever had, and a woman in that garden who had learned, slowly and at some cost, that the things she'd built in the hardest seasons were the ones that held. That was not a perfect story. It was the actual one, which was worth considerably more. She finished the yarrow and straightened up and looked at the row she'd harvested. Clean cuts, good stems, roots intact beneath the soil. Then she looked at the rest of the garden, the comfrey spreading as it always did, the calendula coming in bright and reliable, the lavender that had been the first thing she planted and would probably be the last thing standing. Gideon was still leaning on the fence, still drinking his coffee, not watching her in a way that required response, just present in the way he'd learned to be present, taking up the right amount of space, no more. She picked up her basket and walked toward the cabin, and he fell into step beside her without being asked. And the morning came fully on around them, warm and real and imperfect, which was the only kind of morning worth having.